My name is Captain Tori Myers, and I was 32 years old the morning my own mother asked me to pretend I wasn't the woman I'd become. She stood outside my childhood bedroom holding a navy blue dress, gently lifting it toward me, as though it were the only acceptable choice. Then she quietly asked if, just for one day, I could leave my military uniform in the closet. "The uniform is embarrassing," she said. "Please, just this once. Blend in." I had flown across the country for my younger brother's wedding. For years, I had swallowed my pride and avoided arguments with my family. But standing in that hallway, staring at the dress in her hands, something finally became clear. She had absolutely no idea who would be sitting in that ballroom. Truthfully, neither did I. What happened after I walked through those wedding doors changed my life forever. Welcome back to Hidden Family Revenge, where the relatives who underestimate someone eventually discover they were standing in the presence of the strongest person in the room all along. If you enjoy stories where quiet strength wins in the end, make sure to leave a comment and subscribe, because this is one you won't forget. But before we get to the wedding, you need to understand who I was long before that moment. The apartment I rented near base was so simple that almost everything I owned could fit into a single duffel bag. I preferred living that way. My combat boots stayed beside the front door, my coffee was always strong, and most evenings I was asleep before 9. The Marines I served beside understood me far better than my own relatives ever had. We'd shared field rations, stood long night watches together, and looked after one another whenever someone was struggling. That unit became the closest thing I'd ever known to a real family. My biological family felt completely different, almost like people from another world speaking a language I never learned. I was the oldest child, the daughter who left home at 18 and never returned as the person everyone expected. I mailed birthday cards, attended funerals, and quietly carried the heavy boxes whenever something needed to be done. That had always been my place in the Myers family. Keep everyone happy. Carry the burden. Never make anyone uncomfortable. So when my mother phoned and invited me home for Wes's wedding, I agreed before she'd even finished asking. I always agreed. I booked the flight, pressed my dress uniform without thinking, and convinced myself the weekend would be easy. I'd give a toast, enjoy a dance, congratulate the newlyweds, and fly back to base. Planning complicated military operations had never intimidated me. Trying to predict my own family, however, was a battle I had never learned to win. Even today, there's something about myself I still struggle to explain. I can stay calm while making decisions that affect people's lives. I can give orders under enormous pressure, without hesitation. Yet all it takes is one disappointed look from my mother, and somehow I feel like a frightened little girl again. That weekend, I finally discovered how much that weakness had cost me. Being ignored doesn't happen all at once. It happens little by little. Hundreds of tiny moments that slowly convince you your accomplishments don't matter. When I enlisted, my mother told the neighbors I was simply taking some time to figure out my future. When I earned my commission, she skipped the ceremony because she refused to miss a charity luncheon. When I received a promotion, she immediately changed the conversation to my cousin's expensive kitchen remodel. Eventually, I stopped bringing my career up at all. Whenever I mentioned a deployment, her smile became stiff and distant. Whenever I tried explaining my work, she'd suddenly remember something that needed doing, like refilling everyone's iced tea. I still remember one summer barbecue when a neighbor asked what I did for a living. Before I could answer, my mother answered for me. "Oh, Tori's in the military," she laughed. "It's probably just a phase. She'll settle into something more respectable eventually." I even overheard her telling my father, "The military is embarrassing." She never realized the air vents carried every word straight into my old bedroom upstairs. I heard those words when I was 24, again when I was 28. By the time I turned 30, they no longer hurt. Instead, they simply made me quieter. I'd learned something difficult. You cannot force someone to respect you. So, I became the daughter who mailed Mother's Day gifts, avoided talking about work, and never expected anyone to ask what I actually did. No one ever did. Not my mother, not my father, not even my brother. They had already decided who I was. And as long as I stayed inside that version of me, life remained comfortable for everyone. At least, until the day it didn't. When my mother was 11 years old, one humiliating day stayed with her forever. She never forgot it. To her, my grandfather's military uniform wasn't a symbol of honor or sacrifice. It represented the moment her childhood began falling apart. She remembered sleepless nights filled with shouting, empty kitchen cabinets, and a father whose pain made him someone she feared. So, once she became an adult, she spent every year trying to escape everything that uniform represented. She chased the perfect neighborhood, the right circle of friends, a country club membership she could barely afford, a life that looked respectable from the outside. Then her own daughter chose to wear the very uniform she'd spent decades trying to leave behind. That's the part people rarely understand in stories like this. My mother never truly hated me. She was afraid of what I reminded her of. Every medal on my chest, every ribbon I'd earned, looked to her like a doorway back into the poverty, fear, and embarrassment she'd fought so hard to escape. I understood why she felt that way. Understanding it, however, didn't make the pain disappear. Because when someone sees you as a reminder of their fear instead of as their child, you spend your life being managed instead of loved, hidden instead of celebrated, polished down so you don't stand out. No matter how patient you become, some part of your heart keeps waiting for someone to finally claim you with pride. I'd been waiting for that moment longer than I realized. That wedding weekend finally forced me to admit exactly how long. The conversation happened 2 days before the ceremony. I was standing in my old bedroom unpacking my garment bag when my mother knocked once before opening the door herself. She walked in carrying a beautiful blue evening dress draped over one arm. Without saying much, she carefully laid it across my bed. "I thought this would look lovely on you," she said softly. "It's your size." I looked at the dress, then at her. She avoided looking directly into my eyes. "The Whitfields are very refined people," she explained, speaking a little faster with every sentence. "It's a black tie wedding. A military uniform might be a bit much. People will notice. This really isn't that kind of crowd." I calmly told her I'd planned on wearing my dress blues. Military officers wear them to formal weddings all the time. They're completely appropriate. She shook her head before I could finish. "Just wear the blue dress," she pleaded. "For once, just blend in." There it was. She said it gently, almost lovingly, which somehow made it hurt even more. She wasn't angry. She wasn't yelling. She was politely asking me to erase myself. I stood there holding my uniform in one hand and her dress in the other, as though I were weighing 2 different versions of my life. Immediately, that old familiar instinct returned. Keep everyone comfortable. Carry the burden yourself. Don't make things awkward. For a second, I almost agreed. Honestly, I almost did. Instead, I quietly said I'd think about it. Relief washed across her face. She smiled, squeezed my arm affectionately, and told me she knew I'd understand. Then she walked downstairs to deal with the florist, leaving the blue dress resting neatly across my bed. I sat beside it for what felt like hours. I'd carried equipment that weighed far more than that dress ever could. Yet somehow, that dress felt heavier than anything I'd lifted in years. Here's something I've never been good at admitting. I'm not someone who fights loudly. That's not humility. It's one of my biggest weaknesses. And it's cost me more than once. The same discipline that helps keep people alive during dangerous missions also teaches you to quietly absorb pain without complaint. You learn to wait. You learn to endure. Eventually, you convince yourself your discomfort matters less than everyone else's. So you swallow it. Again and again. My counselor on base once called it over-responsibility. She spoke about it like it was baggage I could simply choose to put down. I never figured out how. That night, I sat on the floor of my childhood bedroom and reached inside the inner pocket of my uniform jacket. There was only one thing I always kept there. A challenge coin. Simple. Heavy. Its edges had been worn smooth by years of running my thumb across them. A close friend had given it to me years earlier. Since that day, I'd carried it everywhere. Whenever life made me question myself, I held that coin. It reminded me who I really was. I'm not ready to tell you the full story behind it yet. That story deserves its own moment. But I can tell you this. Whatever my mother believed that uniform represented, it was never just a phase. It wasn't a costume. It represented one morning I'll remember for the rest of my life. It represented people I'll never have the chance to see again. I sat there holding the challenge coin in one hand while the blue dress rested beside me. One thought kept repeating itself. You've stood in rooms far more frightening than a wedding ballroom. That much was true. The difference was, I'd faced danger countless times. I'd never truly faced my mother's disappointment. I promised myself I'd decide what to wear in the morning. Sleep barely came. The rehearsal dinner was held at the Whitfield estate. It wasn't flashy or loud. It had the quiet confidence that old money often carries. Historic portraits covered the walls. A library with rolling ladders stretched toward the ceiling. Behind the house, a wide lawn sloped gently down to the water. My mother floated through the rooms as though she'd spent her entire life preparing for this moment. Her smile was brighter than usual. She laughed a little too often. She lightly touched people's arms as she introduced Wes to guest after guest. As for me, I was introduced to almost no one. Whenever someone asked who I was, my mother answered before I had the chance. "Oh, Tori's just between careers right now," she'd say before smoothly redirecting attention toward the food table. And as always, I let her. I found a quiet corner with a glass of water and watched everyone else enjoy the evening. Still, two small details stayed with me. At the time, they seemed completely unimportant. The first was an old black and white photograph sitting on a side table. It showed a young Marine in uniform. His posture was proud, his expression steady. The second was an older gentleman standing across the room. Silver hair, perfect posture. He looked directly at me for just a second longer than most strangers would. Without saying a word, he gave me the slightest nod before walking away. I assumed he was simply being courteous. Even so, something about that house felt strangely familiar. I couldn't explain why. I blamed it on the old wood, the polished furniture, and my own nerves. Looking back, I should have trusted that feeling. I was so focused on disappearing into the background that I completely missed the most important truth in the room. The Whitfields were nothing like my mother imagined. By the time I finally realized who they really were, there would be no taking anything back. Later that night, after returning to my childhood bedroom, I slowly unzipped my garment bag once again. I unzipped the garment bag completely and stared at my dress blues hanging beneath the soft glow of the bedside lamp. The dark jacket, the stiff collar, every eagle, globe, and anchor catching the light from the brass buttons. I rarely talk about the first day I earned the right to wear that uniform. My hands weren't trembling because I was frightened. They shook because I understood the responsibility it carried. Every detail of that uniform follows strict rules. Nothing decorative. Nothing unnecessary. Every ribbon has to be earned through service, and everyone is placed exactly where it belongs. There is no pretending, no shortcuts, no way to fake the story it tells. That's one of the things I've always loved most about it. The uniform never lies. It reflects exactly who you've been, whether people choose to recognize it or not. I brushed my fingers across the ribbons on my chest before my eyes drifted toward the blue dress folded neatly over the chair. It was elegant, soft, and forgettable, the kind of outfit worn by someone hoping to blend into the background without leaving an impression. I lifted both outfits, one in each hand, just as I had done 2 nights earlier. This time something finally became clear. When I picture myself walking into the wedding wearing the dress, I felt safe. When I imagined walking in wearing my uniform, I felt nervous. For the first time in years, that fear mattered more than comfort. Fear usually means you're standing close to something important. I zipped the garment bag closed again and placed it beside the bedroom door. I still hadn't made my decision. Unfortunately, life didn't give me much time. The next morning, before I'd even finished my first cup of coffee, Wes found me in the kitchen. He carried 2 mugs and wore the uncomfortable expression of someone rehearsing an awkward conversation in his head. He handed me one of the coffees and leaned against the counter. "So, about the uniform," he began. I waited. He rubbed the back of his neck before speaking again. "The Whitfields are pretty formal. I just don't want it turning into a distraction. It's my wedding day." I really want everything to go smoothly. Then he finally said what he actually meant. Just be normal. Just for one day. There it was again. Different words. Same message. Be normal. As though I'd spent my whole life being anything else. I looked at my younger brother, the little boy whose bicycle I'd steadied until he learned to ride, the man who had never once asked me what I'd actually done during my deployments. And suddenly I understood. He wasn't trying to hurt me. He was afraid. Afraid that his wealthy new family would notice his older sister in uniform, the quiet woman with cropped hair, perfect posture, and experiences no one around that table could understand. And beneath that fear was another one. Standing beside me, he worried he might suddenly seem ordinary. His whole life, he'd been the child everyone celebrated. Deep down, maybe he knew he'd never been tested the way I had. I never said any of that aloud. Instead, I asked one simple question. Wes, do you even know what I actually did overseas? He blinked, opened his mouth, then closed it again. I mean, Marine stuff. That was his answer. Marine stuff. Years of deployments, sacrifice, leadership, loss. Reduced to 2 careless words. On the morning of his wedding, my own brother knew almost nothing about the life I'd built. I simply nodded. I'll be there, I told him. And I'll behave. Then I walked out before he had the chance to see what was written across my face. Lunch that afternoon felt less like a family gathering and more like an interrogation wrapped in polite smiles. My aunts, uncles, and cousins crowded around my mother's dining table, and before long the conversation found its way to me. So, Tori, Aunt Carol asked sweetly, are you seeing anyone? When I answered no, she sighed with theatrical sympathy. You're not getting any younger. And that military life can't last forever. That military life. My uncle jumped in next. I heard they're downsizing. Doesn't that worry you? A cousin asked if I'd considered getting a real career after leaving the service. Every remark landed like another pebble tossed onto my shoulders. I smiled.
Pass the bread.
Answered politely. Across the table, my mother watched it all unfold with quiet satisfaction. These were her people. They spoke her language. They believed the version of me she'd spent years creating. Without realizing it, I disappeared into silence. Smaller. Quieter. Almost invisible. Only one person refused to join the conversation. My Aunt Diane, my mother's younger sister, remained silent at the far end of the table. She kept glancing toward me, then toward my mother, then back down at her plate. Her lips tightened each time someone made another comment. Once she looked ready to interrupt. The words almost reached her mouth. Instead, she picked up her glass of water and stayed quiet. I noticed it the way you notice a door standing slightly open in a house you thought was empty. I didn't understand what it meant yet, but Aunt Diane knew something no one else at that table seemed to know. And whatever that secret was, it was weighing heavily on her. Just 2 hours later, Aunt Diane would unknowingly set everything in motion with one simple action. After lunch, I went upstairs and did something I still wasn't proud of. I slipped into the blue dress. I told myself I only wanted to see whether it fit. That wasn't true. What I was really testing was whether disappearing into the version of myself my family preferred would feel easier than standing my ground. The dress fit flawlessly. Naturally, my mother had chosen the right size. I stood before the mirror that had hung in my childhood bedroom for years and stared at my reflection. The woman looking back at me was beautiful, but she wasn't me. She looked polished, gentle, forgettable. There was nothing about her that hinted at the life she'd lived or the battles she'd survived. She was exactly who everyone downstairs wanted me to become. Someone pleasant, someone quiet, someone impossible to notice. For years, I'd been pretending to be that woman. Seeing her so clearly standing in front of me made something inside my chest tighten.
Part of me wondered if I should simply give in.
Wear the dress, smile through the ceremony, congratulate the happy couple, board my flight the next morning, and keep the peace, just like I always had. No arguments, no embarrassment. Everyone would be comfortable. When I got back to base, I'd tuck Danny's challenge coin back into my dress blues, convince myself none of this mattered, and remind myself that I already knew who I really was. But then another thought surfaced. I'd been repeating that same excuse for almost 10 years. It hadn't protected me. It had only become an easy way to avoid standing up to the only people whose opinions still had the power to hurt me. I looked again at the woman wearing that elegant blue dress. She seemed empty, like she'd traded every meaningful part of herself just to make everyone else feel comfortable. The answer was there somewhere, just beyond my reach. Dress. Or uniform. Disappear. Or finally allow myself to be seen. I still hadn't decided. Then my phone vibrated on the dresser. A text from Aunt Diane. There wasn't a single word attached. Only a screenshot. The moment I opened it, it felt as though the room tilted beneath my feet. Before I explain what I saw on that screen, you need to understand the story behind the challenge coin. Because those two moments collided inside me, and from then on I could never separate one from the other. The coin had belonged to Lance Corporal Danny Brennan, 19 years old. A small town in Ohio with little more than one traffic light. Danny was the kind of Marine who always carried candy in his cargo pocket just so he could hand it out to anyone having a rough day. He insisted on calling me ma'am with a grin so exaggerated it should have been annoying. Instead, it always made me laugh. A week before everything changed forever, he pressed that challenge coin into my hand after a long day. "For luck, ma'am," he said. "You keep it." I laughed and tried to return it. He refused. So I kept it. I still carry that coin today. Danny never got the chance. That's the part of the story I rarely say out loud. Even now, 6 years later, there was a road, a mission, a vehicle that should have made it home. It didn't. 3 Marines survived because of decisions made in less than 2 minutes. Danny wasn't one of them. I've replayed those 90 seconds more times than I could ever count. Eventually, I learned to live beside that memory. Not because it stopped hurting, but because some pain never leaves. You simply learn how to carry it. That's what the coin became. A reminder of him. Every single day, it rests inside my pocket, close to my heart. So whenever my mother called the military embarrassing, she thought she was talking about a profession. She had no idea she was speaking about Danny. About that terrible morning. About the hardest and most meaningful day of my entire life. I closed my fingers tightly around the coin. Then I looked back at my phone. I finally opened Aunt Diane's screenshot. Everything changed. It was an image from a family group chat called Wedding Logistics. Everyone was included. My parents.
Wes.
My aunts. My cousins. Everyone, except me. Aunt Diane hadn't added any explanation. She simply handed me the truth and let it speak for itself. I read the messages once. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. So I read them again. That morning, my mother had written several instructions to the entire family. I can still remember every word. Please make sure no one encourages Tori to wear her military uniform. The Whitfields are extremely refined, and it would be embarrassing. Then another message followed. Seat her at table 9. Near the back, away from the head table. And finally, the sentence that appeared in a group chat shared with everyone except me. The military is embarrassing, and I refuse to let her ruin Wes's wedding. Beneath my mother's message were little thumbs-up reactions. One of my cousins had replied, "LOL, absolutely." Wes had answered with only one word. Fine. My father hadn't written anything at all. I sat on the edge of my childhood bed, still wearing the borrowed blue dress, and read every message again. Then I read them a third time. Oddly enough, I didn't cry. I didn't shake. I became completely still. It was the same kind of stillness that settles over me when everything depends on making the right decision and panic isn't an option. There is a calm that has nothing to do with peace. It's the silence that comes just before everything changes. I laid my phone gently on the bed, leaving the screen lit with my mother's words. Table 9. Keep her in the back. Don't let her turn the wedding into a parade. I stared at those sentences until they stopped feeling like words and started feeling like the truth. For the first time in my life, I understood exactly where I had always stood inside my own family. If I'm honest, I wasn't angry. Most people expect anger. Anger would have been easier. What I felt instead was absolute clarity.
Cold. Sharp.
Like stepping outside into winter air. For 10 years, I'd believed one comforting lie. I told myself my family simply didn't understand me. That beneath the awkwardness and silence, they still loved me. That hiding my accomplishments was simply my mother's strange way of coping. And one day, she would finally come around. That story died on my childhood bed. The truth was much simpler. They understood perfectly. They had simply made their choice. I picked the phone up once more and slowly read through the conversation again. That's when something else caught my attention. The timestamps. My mother's message had been sent at 11:40 that morning. The chat showed my father had read it just 2 minutes later. He saw every word. He read, "The military is embarrassing." He read it knowing those words were about his own daughter. And he said, nothing. Not one sentence. Not one objection. Not even a question. His silence carried its own meaning. I realized I'd misunderstood him my entire life. He wasn't the quiet man trapped between two stubborn people. He was someone who had watched me disappear year after year and decided remaining comfortable mattered more than defending me. Strangely, that hurt even more than my mother's cruelty. At least her behavior came from fear. She believed she was protecting the life she'd fought to build. My father gave up nothing. He only had to stay silent. And he'd become remarkably good at doing exactly that. I stood, slipped the blue dress off, carefully hung it back over the chair, smoothed the fabric with my hands, almost gently. It felt less like putting away a dress, and more like saying goodbye to the version of myself who always chose invisibility. I wasn't furious anymore. I was simply finished hiding. The only question left was what that looked like. Later that afternoon, I arrived at the venue well before everyone else. I needed fresh air, and I needed something to focus on besides my own thoughts. The reception would be held inside an elegant historic club the Whitfield family had used for generations. I wandered through the ballroom while staff prepared the tables, doing what I'd always done before important moments. Observing, grounding myself, learning the space. Near the entrance, I noticed a small brass plaque dedicated to a memorial scholarship. Further down the hallway stood a glass display filled with old photographs. Several of them showed men proudly wearing military uniforms. Just then Sloane found me. She looked beautiful despite clearly feeling overwhelmed by last-minute wedding details. As we walked together through the hall, she smiled toward one of the framed photographs. "That's my grandfather," she said. "He served. Honestly, he's the reason our family is the way it is." She spoke with such effortless pride that it sounded completely ordinary, as though honoring military service was simply part of growing up. Before I could ask another question, someone called her away to solve another wedding problem. I stayed where I was, looking at the young man smiling from that old photograph. The reason this whole family is the way it is. Something shifted quietly in the back of my mind. A small piece of a puzzle. But I was too occupied with my own decision to understand it. I tucked the thought away. Funny how often I did that. I kept walking right past the clues that mattered most. To be fair, I had plenty occupying my mind. I'd spent the entire afternoon deciding to stop hiding from my own family. What I didn't yet realize was that the family my brother was marrying into had spent generations honoring exactly what mine had spent years trying to hide. That night, I finally chose. I laid my dress blues across the bed with careful precision. Then I inspected every inch of the uniform.
I want to be clear about something.
This wasn't revenge. I had no intention of ruining anyone's wedding. I wasn't planning a dramatic speech. I wasn't going to expose the family group chat. I wasn't interested in making a scene. I was simply done helping them erase me. Those are two very different things. For 10 years, my mother had asked me to make myself smaller, so everyone else could stay comfortable. I'd finally decided to stop. I carefully attached each medal in its proper place. Every ribbon represented a date, a memory, a person. When I reached one particular medal, my hands froze. I had to set it down.
Take a breath.
Pick it up again. Twice before I managed to pin it correctly. My hands almost never shake. They've stayed steady through situations far worse than this. That night, they wouldn't cooperate. After everything was in place, I sat quietly beside the uniform for a long time. Let me say something directly to anyone listening. Some of you know exactly what that moment feels like. I almost wore the blue dress. I almost disappeared again because it seemed like the choice that would hurt the fewest people. That's how I'm wired. I've always counted everyone else's comfort before my own. If you've ever hidden the strongest part of yourself just to keep peace around a family table, then you already understand why that hanger felt heavier than anything I'd carried in years. Stay with me, because the moment I finally stopped making myself smaller changed everything that came afterward. The morning of the wedding, I arrived early with my garment bag resting over my shoulder. And I made one decision that still feels important. I didn't wear my uniform into the ceremony. Instead, I changed into simple clothes and quietly slipped into a seat near the back. That ceremony belonged to Wes and Sloane, not to me. No matter how deeply I'd been hurt, I refused to steal even a second of attention from their vows. That was the boundary I chose. So I sat silently, watching my little brother marry the woman he loved. And then something happened that even surprised me. I cried, not out of sadness, not out of anger, but because, despite everything, Wes looked like every emotion had collided inside him at once, excited, anxious, hopeful. Sloane looked at him as if he'd become the answer she'd spent her life searching for. For those few quiet minutes, everything else disappeared. I'm not made of stone. I love my brother. I loved him before I saw those messages in the family chat, and I loved him afterward too. That's the hardest truth about family. Sometimes you know exactly how little someone fought for you, and somehow your heart refuses to stop loving them anyway. I let myself feel that without fighting it. After the ceremony, everyone slowly made their way across the perfectly trimmed lawn toward the reception ballroom. The grand doors were opened by the staff, the string quartet began playing again, and the room filled with laughter, conversation, and the gentle sound of crystal glasses touching. Around 150 guests filled the ballroom, the entire Whitfield circle mixed together with my relatives. My mother was already moving confidently through the crowd, greeting people as though she'd belonged there forever. I waited until the room settled into its own rhythm before slipping away into the small side room where I'd left my garment bag. I shut the door, unzipped it, and carefully lifted out my dress blues. I was almost ready. The jacket was buttoned. Every metal sat perfectly in place. I reached for the doorknob. The door swung open. My mother stood there. The instant she saw the uniform, every bit of color drained from her face. She turned pale, then flushed, and finally looked almost frightened. "What are you doing?" she whispered urgently, pulling the door shut before anyone outside could hear us. "Tori, we already talked about this." I answered quietly. I did think about it, and I've decided to wear my uniform. I'm not planning to make a scene. I'm not trying to embarrass anyone. You can trust me. She didn't seem to hear a single word. Instead, she stepped closer until she was only inches away. Her voice dropped into that sharp whisper I remembered from childhood, the one that always floated upstairs through the heating vents. "The military is embarrassing." There it was again. No softer version. No explanation. Just the sentence itself. "Please wear the blue dress," she begged. "Just this once, blend in. These people aren't like us. Don't turn Wes's wedding into some kind of military performance." I noticed her hands shaking. And underneath all that fear and control, I caught a glimpse of the frightened little girl she'd once been. The 11-year-old whose world had been shaped by shame and poverty. I understood her. I truly did. But understanding her wasn't enough anymore. "No," I said. Her eyes glistened. "Please don't humiliate us in there," she whispered. It sounded like a request. It sounded like a warning. It was somehow both. I looked at my mother for a long moment before speaking. "Mom." I took a slow breath. "I'm not the embarrassing one." Then I stepped around her, opened the door, and walked out into the music and the warm afternoon light before either of us could take those words back. To understand what happened next, you need to picture that ballroom exactly as it was. The ceiling stretched high overhead. Tall windows poured golden afternoon sunlight across the polished floor. The head table stood at the far end while the dance floor occupied the center. Guests gathered in small groups, drinks in hand, waiting for the reception to begin. I entered through a side entrance near the back. My assigned seat was at table 9, exactly where my mother wanted me. If I stayed close to the wall, I could reach it without crossing the room. Without anyone noticing me. Even wearing the uniform, I could still disappear. And for a few seconds, I tried. Old habits don't vanish overnight. I quietly followed the wall toward the back of the ballroom, toward the place that had been chosen for me. I wasn't looking for attention. I'd promised both myself and Wes that I wouldn't create a scene, and I intended to keep that promise. My plan was simple. Take my seat. Stay quiet. Be completely myself. Nothing more. No speech. No dramatic moment. Just a Marine in dress blues, sitting at the back with Danny's challenge coin resting safely over her heart. I'd only taken 10 or so steps when something in the room shifted. If you've spent enough time reading people, you recognize that feeling instantly. The conversations don't stop. They simply soften. The atmosphere changes. Attention begins moving in one direction.
I didn't know why.
I kept walking toward table 9. Then, across the ballroom near the head table, an elderly man with silver hair and perfect posture slowly placed his drink on the table and rose to his feet. Before I tell you what happened next, I need to take you back just a few minutes. Before my mother interrupted me, I'd been standing alone in front of the mirror inside that side room, putting on the uniform piece by piece. The dark blue coat, the high collar, the white gloves. Every medal placed exactly where regulations required, including the highest decoration resting proudly in its place of honor. The gold star caught the light against the red, white, and blue ribbon as its familiar weight settled against my chest. Then I reached inside my coat and found Danny Brennan's challenge coin exactly where it always stayed. I held it in my palm for just a moment. "Brennan," I whispered. "Just once. The way I always did." Then I slipped it back into its place over my heart, hidden safely beneath the medals where it belonged. I looked at my reflection. I didn't see someone. Not some temporary phase. This. So when I stepped into that ballroom, I wasn't trying to prove anything. I wasn't looking for revenge. I was simply done pretending to be someone smaller than I really was. There's a world of difference between getting even and refusing to disappear. That afternoon, I finally understood it. All I wanted was to sit down as the person I'd spent years becoming. What I didn't know was that the room I had just entered was filled with people who immediately understood exactly what that uniform meant. I truly wanted him to be happy, making a spectacle. I didn't see someone causing embarrassment. I saw a United States Marine. I saw every deployment, every watch, every sacrifice, every name I'd promised never to forget. That uniform told the truth without saying a single word. Quietly, I looked at my own reflection and thought, this is who I am. Not the forgotten daughter sitting at table 9. I was about to discover just how wrong I had been. When something unexpected enters a room, people rarely notice it all at once. One person looks first, another follows their gaze, and within seconds the attention spreads quietly through the crowd like ripples moving across still water. That's exactly what happened. As I walked along the back of the ballroom wearing my Marine dress blues, a woman nearby stopped speaking halfway through her sentence. A gentleman lightly tapped his wife's arm and nodded in my direction. The string quartet continued playing, but the conversations around the room softened, replaced by that strange silence that appears when people are trying to understand what they're seeing. I kept my eyes forward and my pace calm, moving the way years of training had taught me, with confidence, but without drawing unnecessary attention. Without meaning to, I found my mother in the crowd. She was laughing with several members of the Whitfield family when she noticed me. The smile vanished from her face instantly. Her body stiffened, and almost unconsciously, one hand rose to her throat. Across from her, my father followed her stare. Even from across the room, I could tell his expression had changed, though I couldn't tell exactly what he was thinking. At the head table, Wes slowly pushed himself halfway out of his chair. For one long moment, no one moved. The room balanced on a razor's edge. It could still become nothing more than an awkward moment, or exactly the public embarrassment my mother had feared. Then the old voice inside my head returned one last time. Stay against the wall. Sit quietly at the back. Don't make anyone uncomfortable. For a second, I almost obeyed. I truly did. But before fear could take control again, before my mother could recover and pretend everything was fine, the silver-haired gentleman near the head table rose completely to his feet. His posture changed in an instant. Only moments earlier, he had looked like any other wedding guest, relaxed and enjoying the celebration. Now he stood with squared shoulders, chin lifted, and the unmistakable bearing of someone who had spent a lifetime in uniform. Then, in a voice that carried effortlessly across the ballroom, he spoke 5 words. At that moment, I didn't know who he was. Later, I learned his name, Sergeant Major Frank Holloway, a retired Marine who had served for 3 decades. He was a longtime friend of Sloane's late grandfather and an honored guest of the Whitfield family. But none of that mattered in those few seconds. All I knew was that his eyes were locked on one medal resting against my chest. Recognition flashed across his face. I knew that look because I'd seen it before. It was the silent understanding shared only by people who know exactly what that decoration represents. He recognized the silver star immediately. A man doesn't spend 30 years in the Marine Corps without recognizing it from across a crowded room. He had likely served beside Marines who had earned one. Perhaps he had buried friends who never lived long enough to wear theirs. The glass he'd been holding was already resting on the table. His napkin had slipped unnoticed onto the floor. Nothing else mattered now. Every eye in the ballroom shifted between me and the retired sergeant major. One by one, the musicians lowered their instruments until the final note of a single violin faded into complete silence. My mother remained frozen where she stood, trapped between the elegant wedding she had worked so hard to protect and the daughter she had spent years trying to keep hidden. Sergeant Major Holloway drew a slow, deliberate breath, the kind taken before delivering a command that everyone instinctively obeys. And in that silent ballroom, he was about to reveal a truth my own family had spent the last 10 years trying to bury. My mother finally found her voice. She walked toward me through the silent crowd with both hands slightly extended, wearing a smile that looked carefully arranged rather than genuine. Then, loud enough for everyone to hear, she declared, "We've always been so proud of Tori. So incredibly proud." As she reached for my arm, it felt less like she was embracing her daughter and more like she was claiming a trophy now that everyone else had decided it was valuable. Several guests smiled, believing they were witnessing a touching family reunion. But I knew better. Her words came too quickly, too perfectly. It sounded like someone desperately trying to rewrite years of history before anyone noticed the truth. The moment she saw that I wasn't smiling, that I wasn't going to help erase a decade of rejection with one convenient performance, her expression cracked. The proud smile disappeared. In its place came panic. "Please," she whispered, barely loud enough for me to hear. "Don't do this. Just this once. Don't embarrass me in front of these people." Even then, even after everything that had happened, even with an entire ballroom standing in my honor, her greatest fear wasn't losing me. It was losing face. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The room was so quiet that calm words traveled farther than shouting ever could. "You spent this entire weekend afraid I'd embarrass you," I said evenly. "You placed me at the back of the room. You called my uniform a parade." I glanced toward the veterans who were still standing. "And the very people you were trying so hard to impress just stood to honor the thing you were ashamed of." She had nothing left to say. Her lips moved, but no words came. Her eyes searched desperately around the ballroom, for support, for agreement, for anyone willing to rescue her. She found no one. My father looked pale, as if years of silence had suddenly become impossible to defend. At the head table, Wes had risen completely to his feet, one hand covering his mouth in disbelief. No one spoke. The silence my mother had created over the years had finally become hers to endure. I gently turned away from her, not because I hated her, but because this moment no longer belonged to her. Instead, I looked towards Sergeant Major Holloway and the 11 other veterans still standing in quiet respect. I lowered my salute and gave them a small nod. I hoped it carried everything I couldn't put into words. Then I faced the room. "Thank you," I said simply. "You have no idea what your respect means to me." I paused for only a moment before saying the one thing my own family had never cared enough to ask. I didn't earn this medal alone. Reaching inside my dress coat, I removed the worn challenge coin that had rested over my heart for 6 years. Holding it up so the light caught its scratched surface, I continued. There were 4 Marines in our vehicle that morning. Only 3 of us came home. This coin belonged to Lance Corporal Danny Brennan. He was 19 years old. The week before we deployed, he handed it to me for luck and made me promise I'd keep carrying it. I looked down at the coin resting in my palm. So I do. Every single day. The medal on my chest doesn't belong only to me. It belongs to Danny. And to every Marine whose name the world may never know. I have the privilege of standing here today because they never got that chance. The ballroom was completely silent. I could hear my own heartbeat. Slowly, I closed my fingers around the coin and returned it to the pocket above my heart, where it had always belonged. I never mentioned the group chat. I never spoke about Table 9. I never told anyone how many years I'd spent making myself invisible. I didn't have to. The truth had already spoken for itself. It stood in the 12 veterans who had risen to their feet. It echoed in one old Marine salute. That was enough. At last, I understood something my mother never had. Neither the uniform nor the medal had ever been a weapon. They were simply the truth. And the truth only needed one thing for me.
To stop hiding it.
Gradually, everyone returned to their seats. One chair after another settled back into place like the tide slowly pulling away from shore. The musicians lifted their instruments once more, and gentle music filled the ballroom again. The wedding remembered it was, after all, a celebration. But before life could fully return to normal, Wes stepped down from the head table. My younger brother crossed the entire ballroom in front of his new wife, her family, and every guest in attendance. When he reached me, he simply stood there. For the first time in our lives, he truly looked at me, not as the older sister everyone misunderstood, not as the quiet Marine, but as the person I'd always been. "I didn't know," he whispered, his voice breaking. I never even asked. There was no performance in his apology. No audience left to impress. The Whitfields already respected him. The wedding had already been saved. This wasn't about appearances anymore. It was simply my brother standing among the ruins of a story he'd believed his entire life, finally realizing how much that belief had cost both of us. "I'm sorry, Tori. Nothing more. No excuses. No explanations. Just 2 honest words. On the happiest day of his life, that honesty meant more than I ever expected. I rested a hand on his shoulder, just as I had when he was a little boy who looked to me whenever the world felt too big. "It's your wedding day," I said softly. "Go back to your wife. Enjoy every minute of it." As I stepped into the ballroom, I had no idea what was about to unfold. At first, only a few people noticed me. One guest looked over, then another followed, and before long the attention spread through the room like ripples across still water. Conversations began fading. A woman stopped talking in the middle of a sentence. A man quietly nudged his wife and pointed in my direction. The string quartet continued playing, but the chatter softened as people tried to understand what they were seeing. I kept my eyes ahead and walked with the calm, measured pace the Marines had taught me. Without meaning to, I spotted my mother standing among a group of Whitfield guests, laughing comfortably. The moment she saw me, her smile disappeared. Her face drained of color, and her hand instinctively rose to her throat. My father turned to follow her stare, his expression unreadable from across the room. At the head table, Wes began rising from his chair. For one long moment, nobody moved. The room hung in silence, balanced between ordinary conversation and something unforgettable. I felt that familiar voice inside me whispering to stay against the wall, keep walking, take my seat at the back, and avoid drawing attention. For a heartbeat, I almost obeyed. Then everything changed. Near the head table, An elderly man with silver hair slowly stood up. His posture instantly shifted from relaxed guest to disciplined soldier. His shoulders squared, his chin lifted, and his eyes fixed on the metal resting over my heart. I didn't know his name then, but later I learned he was Sergeant Major Frank Holloway, retired after 30 years in the Marine Corps and a longtime friend of Sloane's grandfather. The instant he saw the silver star on my uniform, recognition filled his face. He knew exactly what it represented: the sacrifice, the courage, and the terrible cost behind it. Men who spend decades in uniform never mistake that medal. He placed his glass on the table, never noticing his napkin fall to the floor. One by one, the instruments of the quartet fell silent until the ballroom was completely quiet. Then, in a powerful voice that carried across the entire room, he spoke just 5 words. "Silver star in the room." Those words echoed through the ballroom. Without hesitation, he slowly raised his hand in a flawless military salute. An elderly Marine, dressed in a tuxedo at a wedding, stood honoring an officer he had never met, simply because her uniform told him everything he needed to know. The meaning spread across the guests almost instantly. Faces changed as people understood that this wasn't someone seeking attention. This wasn't a costume or a performance. Standing near the back door was a Marine wearing one of the nation's highest awards for battlefield valor. I froze. Combat had prepared me for danger, but nothing had prepared me for that salute. Fighting back tears, I stood at attention and returned it with the same precision every Marine is taught. Then another sound broke the silence. A chair scraped against the floor. Then another. And another. Around the ballroom, veterans quietly rose to their feet. Some rendered a salute. Others simply stood at attention. A man near the center of the room straightened his shoulders. An older woman lifted her chin proudly. A heavy-set veteran pushed himself up slowly, favoring an old injury. Across the room, they continued standing, one after another. Later I counted them. There were 12 veterans in that ballroom. Every single one stood to honor me. No speeches. No applause. Just silent respect from people who understood exactly what that ribbon had cost. The room became completely still. 150 guests watched in absolute silence, while 12 veterans honored not only me, but every Marine who never made it home, including Danny Brennan, whose coin rested over my heart beneath my medals. In the center of that silence, I heard my mother draw one broken breath. For the first time, she realized what she had spent years trying to hide.